It began with a headache. That's how today's guest began a recent blog post. He described how his headache led to a diagnosis of a critical illness. And then he outlined his emergency surgery, treatment, and recovery. Today, we'll learn more about his healthcare journey. And we'll also hear his critique of healthcare communication shortcomings. And he'll share his recommendations for improving the patient experience with a well-crafted content strategy. Welcome to Dope Content. I'm your host, Laura Bergels. With me is Scott Smith, our event co-host, and our special guest expert is Scott Abel, the Content Wrangler. He's joining us today from San Francisco. Scott is an internationally recognized content strategist who helps companies improve the way they author, maintain, and deliver information. He is the co-author of Intelligent Content, A Primer, and The Language of Content. Scott is also the creator of the Content Strategy series of books from XML Press. Now, Scott, thank you for joining us today. And why don't you kick things off by telling us about your journey in content strategy and how it connects to your healthcare experience?
I was just trying to be a diligent professional and take advantage of the fact that I have a lifestyle in San Francisco that afforded me the ability to live in a neighborhood where I have access to an office space and doctor's office, bank, all the little things that a small town might have, but kind of on a little main street hidden inside of a big city. And one day I realized I hadn't taken advantage of my medical benefits and that it was nearing the end of the year. And, as we are encouraged to do so, you try to maximize the amount of benefits that you have. And I had noticed that I had a headache and it was unusual. And I thought, well, I haven't been to the doctor. I have these benefits I'm supposed to use. The doctor's office is literally 30 to 60-second walk away from my office. I will make an appointment and go see my doctor. So I did, and I complained of the headache, but it was my first physical of the year, so she did all the requisite work. Was curious about my headache, but didn't think much about it. Could be so many things: sinusitis, allergies, the list goes on. There are many, many, many things. So of course she started down the path of, let's talk about some of the things that are happening in your life and see if there's a connection that might rear its head and tell us a little bit about the headaches. When that didn't work, she said, well, why don't we do some blood work? And that'll take a day or two for us to get the results back. But maybe you have a diabetes or a sugar issue of some kind, like so many Americans, and that can cause headaches. When she did the blood work, she said, you know what? And there's just one little weird thing from your last blood test result last year. And there was some weird thing in there that makes me think I might need to do another kind of test called an MRI. So I'm going to go ahead and schedule you an MRI. And you'll go to the front desk and they'll tell you when your appointment is. Well, as it turns out, as I was walking out of the doctor's office, the administrative assistant had contacted the MRI department at the local hospital, and they said, we have a cancellation in 2 hours. If he can get over here, we can slide him right in here, and this will be like the painless, easy way to do it, right? So because I'm trying to optimize my time, I said, sure, I'll take that spot. So I went immediately out to get a little bite to lunch and then went to the MRI appointment. They did the scan of me, and then when I came out of the scan, they basically said, hey, we know why you have headaches now. You have a plum-sized brain tumor on your right frontal lobe. Of course, I didn't expect any of this. I was only going to maximize my insurance benefits, and my doctor actually only used the blood test and the MRI as the science part of her experiment, right? What she had thought originally was, okay, while I'm sitting here looking at you, Scott, you wear eyeglasses, and I know you sit in front of a computer all day. Have you also checked with your eye provider? Maybe you should use those benefits too, because what if it's just your prescription is bad and that's why your eyes hurt and your head hurts? Turns out once they got the MRI, they knew it was no longer an issue of blood sugar or of eye strain. Instead, it was just that I had a brain tumor. So, of course, I had no idea that I was going to be diagnosed with a brain tumor. I had simply walked out of my office intending to be back in 30 minutes. I told my assistant, basically, I'll see you in a half an hour. And I didn't see him for a year and a half.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. So the moral of the story, I guess, is never go to the doctor. It's a complete waste of your time.
Well, definitely. I would say that I wanted to know what was wrong, but I was really only trying to use up my benefits in a wise way. And then I thought, well, if I get to, get a new prescription out of this for my eyeglasses and I get to get rid of my headache, this will be a great thing. I did not know that I would have any of these other things to deal with. And so it was quite a surprise. And I think that I'm probably not alone in that. There are probably many times that people go to the doctor for one particular thing under the auspices of they think they know what it might be.
Mm-hmm.
And get there and that's not what it is.
Well, certainly. And there's also the Occam's razor, right? You have a headache, so you think, well, it's got to be, the most obvious thing.
Right.
It's not going to be the least obvious, most tragic thing.
Right. And I didn't have any other risk factors aside from some of the typical ones that American patients do. Slightly overweight. I wasn't a cigarette smoker, so I didn't have that going for me. But I also live in an urban environment. I have a lot of stress. There are many reasons you could have a headache. But I think the big lesson for me was once I realized that I had a brain tumor, I wasn't prepared for that. I didn't know what to expect. And as an intelligent, informed individual, I let my curiosity and my intelligence try to drive my experience. But I quickly learned that medical practitioners are maybe better at some things than others.
I would like you to dive a little bit into that, because I think we hear that message a lot, that medical practitioners may be very good at the medical field, but the communication field may not be quite up to snuff. And what is your experience with that?
Yeah, I think you're spot on with that. That's my experience. But I would back it up a little bit to say that I don't think it's that unusual for us. Now, in the retrospect, I can understand why, and I'll phrase it differently. I own an automobile. When my automobile misbehaves, I go to see an automobile mechanic who not only understands how my vehicle is supposed to run, but also understands what I should be feeding it, what kinds of food I should give it, what kinds of gas, what kinds of oil, what kinds of fuels, fluids it needs to process and run smoothly. And that person is also the diagnostician. So they diagnose the problem, but they know that if you go home and you use these fluids in the way I explained to you, your car will probably perform better. So I always thought doctors should be able to do the same thing. They are closest to knowing what happens to me. They can measure it and they can diagnose it. So they should also be able to tell me, for example, what to eat. Turns out that's not very common either. Most of my doctors have admitted that nutrition was not really part of their education program, and none of them ever said they didn't know anything about food. But they would distance themselves from the topic of food when I would ask about food questions, in the same way that they distance themselves about information when I asked them about the science behind the way that they gave me the information. So the reason it was confusing for me, the information that they provided, was because I had woken up from brain surgery in the neuroscience department. Now, it's important to know that as a content strategist, I run some conferences in which I invite a popular neuroscientist who studies cognition and the impact of the brain on content, or the reverse, the impact of content on the brain. Mm-hmm. And so she had taught me a lot of lessons about the way that the brain works. And so, of course, I thought, I'm in an expert place with neurosurgeons. They just operated on my brain. They should totally be able to understand how to give me information in an appropriate way that aligns for my brain. That wasn't the case. When I woke up from brain surgery, I was groggy, like you might imagine, from having anesthesia. So I can't actually remember every single thing that happened to me, but there were people who were not under the influence of anesthesia in the room at the same time, parents and family members who were able to recount the details that I might have missed. But when I awoke, the very first thing I noticed that I remember noticing was an agitation, like an itch on the side of my body. So I reached down under my sheets and I felt plastic. And I thought, that's so weird. I should be filling my stomach, not a plastic bag. And when I uncovered the draping that they had put over me, I realized that they had a Ziploc baggie full of documents taped to my body. So the neurosurgeon just happened to enter the room at the time. And I'm still groggy and a smart ass without any drugs. So I was already ready to give him my, opinion regardless. Anyway, but I think the first thing I said was some curse words to him and asked him, like, WTF are you thinking? Why is this the delivery mechanism for my documentation? You tape it to my body. And he immediately discarded that and just kept on talking to the rest of my family, probably because they were not inebriated, right, from the anesthesia, and I was. He did engage me, but he wasn't going to go down that pathway of arguing about it. He basically looked at my family and said they tape it to the body, so his body, so that it doesn't become detached from him, so that as they transport him around the hospital, that information stays with the patient, right? And that's the best way we knew how to do it. He signed disclosure documents. We put him in a Ziploc bag. We attached him to the side of his body and wheeled him into the surgery so that when he came out, those documents were there as well. They did accomplish that, right? The documents stayed with me. But when I opened the Ziploc baggie, as he was conversing with my family, I realized that almost all the information was not really information that I needed to know that would make me feel better or secure or to understand my situation. Instead, it was 25 pages, and it might have been 10 or however many, but there were many, many pages of all the bad things that could happen to you. Right. And
well,
so
that's comforting.
Of course. And I understand why, right? It's
yeah.
the same kind of information that you see disclosed very rapidly on television commercials in a very, very light voice. This drug can cause all kinds of horrible things that happen to you. Kidney failure, liver failure, but this was the document that just kept going on and on and on about what had just happened to me. And then the next step was, after surgery, was chemotherapy. So a whole new group of people were followed behind the neurosurgeon to come and talk to me. And they said, now that you've had a successful surgery, we need you to know all the stuff about chemotherapy. What I expected was somebody would give me a personalized narrative. You came into the hospital at 3 o'clock yesterday. You had went to your physician and complained of a headache. Why would they repeat that to me? Because I just had brain surgery, right? Not because humans aren't capable of understanding or memorizing something that happened the day before, but I had brain surgery. So
certainly, and it's also extremely comforting to see that the person across from you has understood what you've been through, and you can correct if there's any misinformation along the way. So that is actually good. Cool.
I agree with that too, but I think my shocker was that I just expected that because they knew that they cut my head open, that they might want to take a little extra care in how they explain stuff to me. So it was really all about me, right? I wasn't concerned about the other patients at the time. But over time, I started to see these patterns emerge. And what I realized was, much like people who work in any company of any kind, in any size, in any organization, in any industry sector, anywhere, people are positioned to do work, and they're given things called personal computers, and they're basically allowed to do whatever the hell they want with those computers as long as they can figure it out themselves or get help from somebody else. There's no universal way of creating content. What I learned in the hospital was those well-intentioned, extremely compassionate, knowledgeable medical professionals don't know shit about information management, and that I'm too close to it. So it's unfair for me to be scrutinizing everything about it without recognizing that they were never taught any of these things, just like all the knowledge workers that you and I and Scott might want to help better understand content strategy. They haven't been taught all these things either, and slowly but surely we're maturing, right? And our knowledge builds, and we share with others, and we get better over time. But when you're in a hospital environment and you just have brain surgery and you're overwhelmed because of the anesthesia, the fear, the uncertainty, and now this stupid way that they present information to you. So basically, I started to tune out the doctor. He was trying to communicate with me, but I was agitated by the information experience. Eventually, he left after congratulating himself because he had determined that my behavior after talking to other people in the room must not be that unusual. My ability to scrutinize information, I'd be doing that whether I had brain surgery or not. If I was at Target and you gave me a shitty experience, I can't wait to tell the Target people how they could fix their information problem. So I think the doctor felt like I did a good job and then left the room. What happens then, though, are other practitioners come in, nurses, nutritionists, psychologists, social workers, And they all have their own vocabulary and their own personal computer, and they print things out and they use different words and different fonts and different layouts and different approaches. So it was such a mishmash to me. I think I started to realize that if I couldn't parse it and I understand why it's happening, it must be really hard. If you're mentally incapacitated or you're in a foreign country, the person next to me was from a different country and didn't speak English.
Oh boy.
So imagine the complications on top of that with translation and localization and understanding customs and culture with the hospital staff.
Scott, one thing I remember, a medical experience I observed was, when my father was in his late 50s, he had triple bypass. The experience, as I remember it, was fairly smooth. For one thing is that you had fewer channels. You basically had professional voices talking, or you had paper.
Right.
There wasn't, as you described in one of your blog posts, the voicemails, the emails. I don't know, maybe a blog post or two from a doctor or something like that. But while he was in pre-op, we got the family that was there, my mother and my sister and I, we got a pretty tight and well-produced video telling us what to expect. This is your team, and this is what's going to happen. You may be able in 3 weeks be able to, or a few days, dangle your feet over the side of the bed as the patient and all that. And it seemed pretty crisp and clean. From my vantage point, the other thing that was an advantage, my father was a nurse.
Right.
And he had many, many years as a, working in military hospitals prior to that. And so I think that, he was able to understand and advocate for himself. But a couple of years before that, we had talked a little bit about this. I had a brain tumor, a benign brain tumor, when I was a teenager. And even that, as a kid who didn't know that much about all these things, it seemed, when I was physically able to comprehend information, it seemed comprehensible to me and understandable. And I could always rely on my father, for clarification. But there were so many times that they spoke to me about things like just after my surgeries. When I was, not quite fully out of anesthesia, or I was in blinding pain. And it's just like, I don't know what I'm supposed to do with this right now. I can't write anything down. But I think that happens a lot now, because my most recent experience several years ago was in the emergency room, was just one professional after another just coming in and out of the bedrooms and telling me something kind of different about whether I was eligible to have an MRI or not. I found that I'm not. I have metal in my head. It was very bizarre to find out that they were scheduling an MRI and then being told I can't have an MRI. And it's just like, who knows what would have been yanked through my skull if I had one. And that was kind of bizarre. I think you had written about some problems with MRIs after the first one with your tattoos, right?
Yeah, I had, when I was in the MRI machine, it turned out the initial MRI, so right after I went and complained of the headache and was diagnosed with, I don't know what you have condition, you're going to need an MRI. The MRI machine itself was in the older emergency room, I've learned, in the hospital chain that I went to. And as a result, that MRI machine might be smaller in circumference. And so, of course, Americans have gotten bigger in circumference, but that machine has stayed the same size.
Sure.
I may have actually been touching the side wall to cause some heat, but I didn't know that. And I had just had ink done on my plethora of tattoos that I have. And the red ink itself is known for sometimes in the newer inks having some kind of metallic to give it that sheen that it has on people when you can really see red pop off their skin. So I was just concerned that if they didn't really know that much, maybe that would be a problem for me. So they did some research and they couldn't figure out whether or not the ink that I had the metal in it. My tattoo artist didn't know. So long story short was they decided they would err on the side of let's not give him an MRI, let's give him a CAT scan. But my neurosurgeon was like, no, the data I need is in the MRI. He needs the MRI. You just need to wrap him up in some ice cold towels and slide his ass in there because we need that picture. So that was the approach that they did. But as a result, they agreed to that procedure, but then they had to create a custom procedure for me and then get me to agree to it because it's not the standard way that they did things. It came in at like some crack of dawn, 5:30 in the morning before my 7:30 thing to explain to me that they had deviated from the standard protocol and they wanted me to understand why. And they did a great job of doing that verbally. Mm-hmm. But when I left the hospital, it got more complicated.
But you know what? It strikes me that as a content strategist and as a surgeon, one of the things that we have in common is the use of checklists. And it would seem that before you give somebody an MRI, to me, a non-medical professional, that going through a checklist of, and does he have metal in his head, and does he have a tattoo that may cause a problem, is a huge part of being prepared for the procedure that you're going to do.
And they did do that, by the way.
Okay.
And I've had subsequent MRIs as a checkup and balance, and they do that. There's a form that they make you fill out. Of course, that puts the onus on the patient. Now,
sure.
Has to read it, understand it, comprehend it, react appropriately. Oh, and by the way, fill out the information correctly. We're all error prone, so we could be making mistakes willy-nilly, and they have no idea whether we are or not. But the biggest challenge really wasn't then. It was when I left the hospital. When I left the hospital, I had had the brain tumor removed. They had kept me for a sufficient amount of time, whatever that was, to heal so I could come home and then prepare for chemotherapy. But the minute I got home, my phone starts ringing, and it's a lot of numbers that you can't identify for reasons associated with the Healthcare Privacy Act, which has been repeatedly used as an excuse for me. The HIPAA is what I'm talking about. And so I would ask, I would answer the phone, and it would be my insurance company, and it would be somebody called a caseworker nurse or something like that, and she would claim that she was signed by the insurance company to help me with my health care. And so she would start asking me a bunch of questions to engage me on the phone. And I said to her, all these questions are really confusing, and I don't understand because most of the questions she was asking, they're not about me. They were risk-adverse questions. They were asking, like, did they give you instructions on how to care for your wound? And I'm like, okay, first of all, I have friggin' brain surgery. I don't have a scab on my arm that might get infected. I have brain surgery. Don't you know why are you asking me these questions? What I learned was, over time, those questions were basically ticking off boxes that might cause the healthcare provider to have to pay for more services that the insurance company would have to reimburse them for. And so the insurance company was basically using a checklist to see if I'm minimizing the risk to them. But when I challenged her and said, you started the call off saying this is a service that will benefit my healthcare. Exactly how are these questions benefiting my healthcare? And then when she, tried to regurgitate an answer that was probably just something that she conjured up on her own, because it's probably not a question that everybody asks all the time, and it might not be available in the frequently asked questions section of her website. But her excuse was so lame that I realized that it's just a job for her. She's calling people. It probably does help. They identify somebody who's confused mentally, and they can recommend somebody to help them. But there was really nothing there for me. And when I asked her, do you not know what I went through? Why are you calling me and saying you could help me heal if you don't know what I went through? And she would say, well, because HIPAA, and then start trying to explain it with the rest of a sentence. And I would cut her right off and go, HIPAA is not an excuse. It's an act. I know what it is. I probably could recite half of the requirements. I'm like, I've worked on all these projects, and I understand that they're bootstrapping the knowledge, that you have and giving you just enough so you can call me. But your feedback to your bosses is, don't call me back because I don't think that you have my best interest in mind. I think you're collecting data to make sure that I'm following instructions so that the insurance company doesn't have to pay for things unnecessary, that if you didn't do this, I might actually get an infection or something. And so I think it was really challenging for that person. But what frustrated me was there's no forethought in this. We live in a world where mobile phones are not used for phone. The most common use of an iPhone is not to call people. Why is that? Because most of the calls we get are automated robocalls from computers that are abusing the ability to do that. And because of HIPAA, they, insurance providers, healthcare providers, hide their identity from your phone. So now the phone rings. I don't want to answer it because I think it's a robocall from a politician or somebody accusing me of, some crime. And they're like, I got one this morning. They said they were going to cut off all my Social Security benefits. So I think there's a missing component here, which is the reality of how information travels from one place to another and all the obstacles that are in the way. What the providers say is, we reached out to you, but you didn't answer. We reached out to you, but you hung up on us. Or we reached out to you and you wouldn't give us the information that we needed. And my pushback is, you don't understand my customer experience. You say you're patient-centered, but I'm not at the center of any of this.
Precisely.
And so
I really feel that I signed up for a new insurance company versus, through the healthcare.gov situation. And I'm already feeling like I've made the wrong decision with this or this medical insurance, because I got one of those robocalls and it was such an awful robotic voice. It wasn't even trying to sound human. It was so bizarre. But the message on it was, you have to call us back right away. We have a very important message for you.
Right.
Like, okay, if you have a very important message for me, what is it?
Right. I realize that healthcare organizations and insurance organizations are not doing that. These are usually third-party, malicious intent people trying to rip it off. But it's not a secret. It's common knowledge. It's on TV. It's been written about it all over the place. Why can't hospital administrators and insurance companies say, look, I get that it's the easiest way is to robo-program these calls and have somebody call. But I got like 5 of them this week, and they're trying to schedule my MRI. But when the voicemail answers, they disconnect. They don't leave a message because it's a machine. Right? So I never, ever get the message. So now, thank goodness, there are different channels. There's an app associated with my healthcare at the hospital. My insurance company has one. But now my problem is, oh, thank you. Now I have 9 apps that don't talk to each other. So it just gets worse. The phones, the apps, the people using the communication, and the human beings add to the mix. In one of the articles I wrote, I was trying to explain that the discharge procedure from the hospital involves trying to educate the patient as best as they can so that the patient can go home and continue convalescence in the safest, best way possible. And in order to do that, you have to give people information. Well, the nurses over my chemotherapy 16-week treatment in the hospital, so I was not doing this and then going home. I would stay in the hospital for weeks at a time. When I did that, the nurses would eventually learn a little bit about you. And they converse with you, and they would learn that he cares about information management. And they would start engaging me on that. And I could tell that there were like 2 nurses that they must be like the go-to people when they need to produce some information. And so one of my chemo nurses came to me and she said, I'm going to give you your discharge paperwork a day early. And I thought, I heard I'm leaving a day early. But she saw that on my face and she was like, no. Let me re-communicate with you, Mr. Communication. I won't be here tomorrow because it's my day off. And I know how much you rely on quality information. So I'm going to give you your discharge paperwork today. We're going to review it so you're comfortable with it. Then we're going to pretend none of that happened. And tomorrow when I'm on my day off, my replacement nurse will come in. She will print your discharge paperwork and present it to you. You won't have to scrutinize it and be worried about what is dumbass doing over there with a different story than what you got the day before. Instead, you'll be confident. So I said, great. I looked at the materials. I told her I understood it. And she asked me an interesting question. Is there anything that's not in here that you're curious about that maybe I should have put in here? And I thought, what a great question for somebody to ask. She totally understands that I'm searching as a patient for additional knowledge. And I said, yes, but I feel embarrassed about asking about this, but not because of the subject matter, but because I'm not interested in it. So here's what I asked her. I said, chemotherapy is so dangerous that apparently when visitors come to my room and use my bathroom, they have to take extra precautions because I use the same bathroom and I have chemotherapy in my body. Which begs the question, why is there not a section in here about what happens if you go home and have sex with somebody? And then I said, I'm not embarrassed because of sex, and I'm not interested in having sex. I mean, when you're undergoing chemotherapy, sex is the last thing on your mind. But if you're going to be a medical practitioner and give advice to people who are going home, once I'm home, I'm not in your control anymore. I need to know, and so does every other patient. But what happened was she wrote a great section on it. She came back right before she left to clock out and go on her day off. And there was a great section in there, and it was divided in 3 parts. One about sex and chemotherapy in general, one about sex and pregnancy and chemotherapy, which I thought was extremely important, and then just another one about sex and body fluids and danger because of chemotherapy and what you can do to eliminate it. That made me very happy because I felt listened to and comforted by the fact that she went out of her way to do that. So I sent her on her way. The next morning I woke up. I did not spill the beans. The nurse came in. She printed out the discharge. She announced, surprise, you're going home. And she gave me the paperwork, and I flipped to the page to see the sex ed part. Not there anymore. Yeah.
Oh, she printed out the form. Nothing personalized for you. And that was my question, though, is that this was personalized for you. It didn't affect the policy change.
No, but even if
communication, it didn't even. It was only personalized for you temporarily. You got the form template afterwards.
And that wasn't her intent. Her intent was to alter the discharge package they give to everyone and to use my knowledge of information management and of going through chemotherapy to see if I would spot something that she, as a nurse,
good
expert, would identify with as missing. And so the sex information she put into the discharge kit was supposed to be distributed to everyone from that point forward.
Oh.
But the nurse who took her place that day is not as comfortable speaking about sex to people, and so she deleted it. So, of course, I went ahead, signed it, got the hell out of there. But when the nurse that I engaged with who added the sex information into the thing came back and I came to my next round of chemotherapy, I showed her both copies. And then I said, this is the shit that gets your hospital in trouble. I'm like, you're in charge of the information, even if it's not official, and you're the one that's doing it, and then somebody else can come in and just change it willy-nilly. What happens if they change it and they make it wrong? Deleting something is one thing, but what happens if she just changes the way that she didn't like the words that you used, and now you're using some words that are slightly the same, like synonyms, but not identical? And she said, oh my gosh, there are so many things wrong with this process.
You talked about this a little bit earlier too, and I didn't follow up on it, but consistency, of course, is important, but having a similar vocabulary across all the wide range. A really short anecdote, I'm in excellent health, but about 5 years ago, I went to a doctor, and she said, oh, I can't treat you. You need to go to the ED. And I said, I think there's some kind of mistake. I don't have erectile dysfunction.
Right.
And
I would have said.
Yeah. And she says, don't be a smartass. And I'm like, I'm not being a smartass. I don't know what an ED is. What? So it turns out she meant emergency room. And she goes, everybody knows that. And I said, wasn't there a huge television show on about 10 years ago called ED? No, there wasn't. It was called ER. Everyone knows ER. Nobody knows ED is anything except erectile dysfunction.
I recommend this to everybody. Think twice before you say an acronym, because even your colleagues may not have the same acronym vocabulary set that you do. And people that went to different medical schools or dental schools may have something different. And people outside of your profession are probably not going to recognize it at all.
Yeah, it's a bedside manner thing in some respects. So I'm stereotyping, and I will tell you that I have great medical experience overall. But I can see the cocky nature of some medical professionals that I personally had experience with. And they were very, very happy to be experts at what they're good at, and it's nice that you're or me or we're experts at something else, go do that, right? Like,
Sure.
they weren't really that engaged in learning more. I was pissed about it because I saw neuroscience and brain, and I heard the word science. So I said, are you aware there's information science? He didn't like that. Oh, and I said, well, you fucking need to know that because I'm a patient. You're coming in here and actually making things worse and making it more confusing by the choices that you make. And I go, and then just let these people bring this cavalcade of information in here, print it off of whatever laser printer. And by the way, the reason that the person responsible, this was the answer in my experience only, was when I asked who's responsible for this information, they say the person who sits closest to the laser printer. So this is their strategy. Their content strategy is, we need some information. Okay, great. Who's over there next to the laser printer? Are you busy? Okay, could you make a sign? So, of course, they decide that the sign needs to be in Comic Sans, right, font, and it needs to be big because red is important, so they make a word red. But it's not the word that I should be looking at. So what's happening is, because they don't understand information science, they're causing people to see something that's not the important thing on the sign that they've designed. Or the words that they use are causing, as Scott mentioned, some kind of confusion. So I think the missing element is science. And if we could get information scientists, and there is a discipline of people who do this, right, that are medical informatics experts that try to merge these disciplines and help them do better. But I have a feeling until we have some serious thought about that, and there's some probably bad things that have to happen to companies, like they have to get sued into submission or be found to be non-compliant in order to affect change, because it's all available to them. All this information is not hidden, right? They have access to science journals. So I feel like patients have to advocate for themselves, and so it behooved me to go out of my way to try to help my healthcare professionals do a better job. There are a small number of people inside of each one of the healthcare teams that I engaged that were extremely interested in this, to the point where I think they would really go off on their own and try to learn how to do better. But where am I to point them?
Correct.
What am I supposed to tell them? You need to go do 15 years of work like we did, to learn all this stuff that we learned about content strategy? That's not efficient use of their time, and it won't happen in a medical establishment or insurance company.
Where can we find you in the future coming up?
Well, let's see. I am going to be spending the next year trying to figure out how to marry my knowledge and experience in information management and content strategy with healthcare in some way. I'm not exactly sure where I will land. My trajectory for my career will change a little bit, but you can see me at at my conference, Information Development World, which takes place February 25th through 27th in beautiful Palm Springs, California in 2020. We're going to hopefully have some of you. I know that Scott made a submission, and I would love to have you participate too if you'd like. We bring content people together from marketing, technical communication, and product management, try to help them understand how they might relate to each other and create better experiences, much like healthcare and insurance people could relate better if they understood information management.
Well, terrific. I'm going to put the links to that, as well as all the other places we can find you, in the show notes.
Excellent. InformationDevelopmentWorld.com. If you're interested in speaking, we're still taking some submissions for a little while, so check out the website, and I hope to see you there.
Terrific. Thank you for joining us today, Scott.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thanks for talking about this. I think it's a great topic.